They left it to die in the rain. No healer came. No warrior stood close. Not a single soul in that entire village took one step toward the small black wolf cub trembling beneath the ancient shrine, because every one of them had seen the mark burned into its fur, the mark of the curse. 3 men who had touched it were already dead. The elders said the cub was a sign from the moon goddess herself, a warning, an omen. A sentence written in fur and silver light. The village of Scruggs had seen plagues and droughts and the long shadow of war, but nothing made grown warriors step backward the way that cub did. Nothing made mothers grab their children and pull them indoors with their eyes wide and their hands shaking. "Leave it," they said. "Anyone who protects the cursed bleeds with it." And they meant it. The first man, old Carver, the blacksmith, had reached toward it on the first night, just to move it away from the shrine steps. By morning he was dead. His wife said he never even woke up. The second man had tried to cover it with a cloth from a distance, using a long stick, like you'd move a snake. He lasted 2 days. The third was a healer from the Eastern District, who had insisted superstition was no reason to let a creature suffer. He died before he finished the sentence. After that, nobody argued. The cub stayed beneath the shrine. Rain came. The mark pulsed silver and cold in the dark, and then she walked out of the rain. A wolfless Omega. No rank, no wolf, no family. The kind of woman the village forgot existed on a good day. The kind who moved through crowds like water around stones, leaving no trace, asking for nothing, receiving nothing in return. She was thin from a winter of giving her own meals to people older and sicker than herself. Her shawl was torn at the shoulder. Her boots were held together by a cord she'd found in a gutter. She stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at the cub. She looked at the mark. She looked at the rain soaking into its black fur, at the way its small sides shook with every breath, at the way its golden eyes, barely open, barely there, were fixed on the empty dark above it, as if it was already saying goodbye to a world that hadn't bothered to say hello. She stepped forward. "Don't." A woman grabbed her arm. It was Dessa, the innkeeper's wife, broad and solid and frightened in the way only people with something to lose can be frightened. "Ellen, don't you go near that thing." Ellen looked at Dessa's hand on her arm. Then she looked at the cub. Then she reached down, wrapped it in her torn shawl, pulled it to her chest, and said 4 words that changed the course of an entire kingdom. "I will not leave you." The mark pulsed once, and then it went quiet. The crowd stepped back as one. Dessa made a sound like a woman watching someone walk off a cliff. Someone in the back called for the elder. Someone else said a prayer, low and fast, the kind you say for the dead. But Ellen was already walking, the cub pressed against her chest, its shallow breathing warm against her collarbone, and she didn't look back. Her name was Ellen, and in the village of Scruggs, that name meant very little. She had been born in the territory 17 years ago, the daughter of a wolfless Omega mother and a father who had left before Ellen was old enough to remember his face. Her mother had died of a fever when Ellen was 9. After that, she had lived on the margins, on the edge of other people's generosity, in the corner of other people's rooms, at the end of other people's tables. She had grown up watching the world from doorways. She had learned very early that the safest place to be was the place no one was looking. In a wolf society, the absence of a wolf was not simply a disability. It was a kind of death while living. Every wolf child in Scruggs territory shifted for the first time between the ages of 12 and 14. It was a ceremony, a rite, a public moment of becoming. Ellen had waited. 12 came and went. 13, 14, 15. She had stood in the shifting grounds on the night of her 14th year with every child, her age around her. Watched them change one by one, watched them find their other selves. Silver wolves and black wolves and wolves the color of autumn leaves. And she had stood in the middle of all, and felt nothing. Nothing shifted. Nothing woke me up, nothing came. The elder had looked at her for a long time, and then looked away. That look said everything. It said, "You are one of the hollow ones." It said, "You have no place in the hierarchy." It said, "From this day forward, you are less." She had walked home alone that night, and sat on the floor of the empty room that had been her mother's, and told herself it didn't matter. She had been telling herself that for 3 years. What she had instead of a wolf was a kind of quiet attention that most people never developed because most people never needed it. She noticed things. She noticed the way sick animals held their weight, which leg, which shoulder, which way they turned their head when the pain was worse. She noticed the rhythm of breathing, the color of gums, and the temperature of skin. She had started tending to the wolves who were brought to the village healers, too injured for normal care, and not important enough for the senior healers' time, the ones they left in the back cages and checked on twice a day. She would sit with them for hours. She would talk to them. She would adjust their positions when they couldn't do it themselves, and change their bandages when the healers forgot, and find ways to get water into them when they were too weak to lift their own heads. They recovered faster than they should have. Nobody asked why. Nobody was paying enough attention to ask. The village of Scruggs sat on the eastern border of the Blackmere Kingdom, close enough to the old forest to hear the trees move at night, and far enough from the palace to have been forgotten by most of the court. It was a working village. Hunters, tanners, small-scale healers, traders who came through twice a year and rarely stayed. The Scruggs Alpha was a man named Breck, a heavy-set warrior with a grudge against the Blackmore crown that was old enough to have its own children. He ruled the village the way men who have been overlooked always rule things, with the weight of accumulated resentment pressing down on every decision. Under Breck, the wolfless were given work, but never status. They cleaned and carried and cooked, and were allowed to attend pack meetings, only to listen, never to speak. Ellen had stopped attending pack meetings at 15. No one had noticed. She spent her days moving between the healing cages and the homes of the elderly, and the small patch of medicinal herbs she kept at the back of the shed where she slept. She had no bed. She had a mat on the floor, a blanket, a small chest with her mother's things inside. A pressed flower, a clay ring, a letter she had read so many times the paper was soft as cloth. She ate what was left. She slept when she could. She did not complain, because complaining requires an audience, and Ellen had never really had one. The night the cub appeared had started as an ordinary night. There had been a storm warning since afternoon. The kind of iron-colored sky that the border villages knew meant serious weather. Ellen had spent the evening securing the animal cages, reinforcing the latches, making sure the injured wolves in her care were dry and warm. She had been the last one in the healing yard. She had been about to go back to her shed when she heard it. Not a cry exactly, more like the sound a cry makes after it gives up. The last note of a sound that has been going on for a very long time, with no answer. She stood still in the rain and listened. It came from the shrine. The Scruggs shrine was old. Older than the village, older than the territory, older than anyone alive could account for. It was a stone platform beneath an arch of iron-black wood, carved with the symbols of the moon goddess and the old wolf bloodlines. Nobody used it anymore. The current elder had called it a relic, but the old women of the village still left offerings there on high moons, dried herbs, white stones, cups of clean water, and the general understanding was that the shrine was not a place you disturbed. Ellen walked toward it anyway. She saw the glow before she saw the cub. Silver-white, pulsing in the dark, soft as a heartbeat. Then she saw the black fur, the small shaking body, the golden eyes that found hers across the distance, with an expression that had no business being in the face of an animal. An expression that was specific and deliberate, and that said clearly and without any room for misunderstanding. You. She had crouched down and looked at the mark. It covered the cub's left shoulder, spreading through the fur in a branching pattern like frost on glass, glowing with that cold silver light. She had heard of the mark of the curse, the way everyone in the territories had heard of it. As a story told to explain misfortune, as a legend used to make sense of things that had no better explanation. She had not believed it was real. The mark was real. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the cub. It was shivering so hard its teeth were clicking together, a small percussive sound like rain on a tin roof. She thought about the 3 men who had died. She thought about Dessa's hand on her arm. She thought about what the elder would say in the morning. Then she thought about her mother, dying in an empty room while the healers were busy with someone who mattered more. She thought about standing in the shifting grounds, the only one left standing, while everyone looked away. She reached down. She wrapped it in her shawl. She walked back through the rain to her shed, latched the door, lit the small lamp, and began assessing the cub, the way she assessed every injured animal that came to her, carefully, methodically, without panic. The mark continued to pulse. But it did not spread. And the cold silver light, which everyone had said brought death on contact, simply rested against her skin like moonlight through a window. She noted that. She noted everything. By morning the village knew, in a place as small as Scruggs, secrets lasted approximately as long as it took for someone to look through a window. Dessa had told her husband. Her husband had told Breck's second, a man named Holt, who had the information velocity of a market crier. By the time Ellen carried water to the elderly woman 3 doors down, who couldn't manage the well on her own, 6 people had already made eye contact with her, in a way that meant they had opinions they were about to share. Elder Marin found her before noon. Marin was 81 years old and had the posture of a woman who had decided sometime in her 60s that gravity was optional. She walked with a staff and the absolute conviction of someone who had outlived everyone who had ever disagreed with her. She found Ellen in the healing yard cleaning bandages and stood at the gate and said, without greeting or preamble, "You have brought a death sentence into this village." Ellen wrung out a bandage. "Good morning, Elder." "Don't say good morning to me. The cub with the mark has been touched. You touched it. You're still standing, which is," she paused, and something complicated moved across her face. "Not what I expected. But the mark is still active. I can feel it from the gate. Whatever is keeping you alive, it won't protect the rest of us." "I'll keep it away from the rest of you," Ellen said. "It stays in my shed." I closed the door. "You'll take it out of the village. It's injured. It can't be moved far." "Ellen." Marin's voice changed, not softer exactly, but different, less official. 3 men are dead. Breck is already furious. If he finds out you're keeping that thing, he'll find out eventually, Ellen said. He finds out everything eventually. I'll deal with it then. Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the healing cages, at the wolves Ellen had been tending, all of whom were watching her with that specific quiet attention that animals gave to people they had decided to trust. Then she looked back at Ellen. "You're either very brave," she said, "or very stupid." "Probably both," Ellen said. "I usually am." Marin left without saying anything else. That was, Ellen understood, the closest thing to permission she was going to get. She went back to the shed and sat beside the cub, in the light of day, with the lamp replaced by the thin winter sun, coming through the shed's one window. She could see the cub more clearly. It was young, perhaps 8 weeks, she estimated, perhaps 10. Black all the way through, the kind of black that was almost blue in certain light. Its paws were disproportionately large for its body, the way pups' paws always were, suggesting it would be a large wolf eventually. Its golden eyes were unusual, not the amber common to most wolves of the territory, but a deeper, stranger gold, the color of old coins, with a ring of something darker around the iris that she had never seen in a wolf before. The mark covered its left shoulder completely and extended down the left foreleg and up the left side of its neck. In daylight, it was less frightening than it had been in the dark. Still silver, still pulsing softly, but slower now, more like breathing than warning. The cub watched her work. It didn't flinch when she touched the marked area. It didn't growl. It pressed its nose briefly against her wrist when she reached across it for the water bowl, the way a pup will seek contact, not because it wants something, but because it has decided you are safe. "I don't know what you are," she said quietly. "I don't know where you came from, or who you belong to. But I know what it feels like when nobody comes, and I'm not going to be another person who looks away." The cub held her gaze. Then it put its head down on its paws and closed its eyes. She named it Mira, after her mother, because it seemed like a name that meant something survived. What she didn't know, what she had no way to know, was that in the palace of Blackmere, 400 miles to the north, a man was losing his mind. Alpha King Darrell C. Brown had not slept in 11 days. His generals had learned to read his silences the way sailors read weather. Some silences meant he was thinking and would give orders soon, and some silences meant the room was not safe, and everyone in it should find a reason to be somewhere else. The silence he had worn for 11 days was a new category entirely. His generals had no name for it. They gave it a wide berth and spoke in low voices and did what they were told, and nobody asked questions that didn't have to be asked. Julia was gone, his daughter, 4 years old, black-haired and gold-eyed, and possessed of a stubbornness that had driven her nursemaids to collective despair, and had made her father love her with the specific, helpless ferocity that very few things in a man's life can produce. She had disappeared from the protected east wing of the palace on a night when every guard was in position and every door was locked. There had been no ransom demand, no note, nobody. Just an empty room and a single window left open, and the faint smell of something Darrell's tracker described as old magic. The kind that hadn't been practiced in centuries, the kind that existed in histories and warnings, and the margins of texts that nobody was supposed to be reading. Every search team he'd sent had come back with nothing. Every informant he'd pressed had known nothing. Every ally he'd contacted had heard nothing. His chief advisor, a man named Corvin, had spent the 11 days being indispensable, organizing the search parties, managing communication with the outer territories, keeping the political machinery running while the king was not present enough to run it himself. Corvin was the kind of man who became most useful in a crisis, and that utility had never once made Darrell suspicious of it. It should have, but Darrell was not thinking clearly. Darrell was thinking about a 4-year-old girl who had his eyes and her mother's courage, her mother, who was 3 years dead, who had made Darrell promise before the end that he would keep Julia safe. And he was thinking about how he had promised, and how the promise had meant something, and how it meant nothing now. "We keep looking," he said, to the room, to no one specific, to the version of himself that still believed she was alive somewhere and could be found. "Yes, my king," Corvin said, from his position 3 feet to the left, always exactly 3 feet to the left, always exactly the right distance to be useful without being intrusive. "Every territory, every village, every border, it is being done. Then why is she not here?" It came out raw. He hadn't meant it to. He pressed his fist against the table and breathed through the rawness until it was something he could manage. Something found her. Something took her. Something that used old magic and left no trace. "We are investigating the old bloodlines," Corvin said. "There are texts." "I don't want texts." He looked up. His eyes were the amber of his wolf form, and they were hard in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the place a man goes when he is made of grief and cannot stop moving. "I want my daughter." 400 miles south, in a shed in the border village of Scruggs, a cub named Mira pressed its nose against the hand of the only person who had chosen to stay, and breathed. 3 days passed. The cub ate, slowly at first, Thin broth that Ellen made from bones she traded 3 hours of work to acquire, coaxed into it with a patience that required her to sit on the floor of the shed for 2 hours at a stretch until the cub decided on its own that she was not trying to poison it. Then more confidently. Then with the specific enthusiasm of a creature that has decided survival is worth committing to, the mark continued to pulse. But its light shifted. Less like a warning now, and more like something that had been alarmed and was calming. Ellen noted it. She wrote it down in the small journal she kept, the one she used for animal observations, the one no one had ever asked to see. She noted other things too. She noted that when the cub was stressed, when there were loud sounds outside, or when strangers came near the shed, which happened twice when she wasn't there, the mark flared bright. And she noted that when she was close, when she was touching it or speaking to it, or simply present in the same space, the mark quieted. She didn't know what to make of that yet, but she wrote it down. What she didn't have time to think about carefully enough was Breck. Breck came on the third morning with 4 of his men, and unlike Maron, he did not start with a conversation. Ellen heard them coming, heard the boots, the number of them, the particular rhythm that meant official, and stepped out of the shed to meet them in the yard before they could come to her door. She was not going to let them in the shed. That decision was made before she was fully awake. Breck was a big man. Not tall exactly, but broad, the kind of broad that came from decades of fighting, rather than feeding, muscle wrapped tight over a frame that had been through enough to know exactly how much punishment it could absorb. He wore the Scruggs alpha chain and an expression of contained fury that she had seen him direct at trading partners who tried to cheat him, and at wolves who failed him in the field, and at the general concept of Blackmore authority. He had never directed it at her before, because she had never been worth directing it at before. "You're keeping the cursed cub," he said. "Not a question." "It's injured," Ellen said. "It needed care. 3 men are dead. Yes, and I'm not. So whatever killed those men, it hasn't killed me, which suggests the story about the curse might be more complicated than we thought." She watched him calculate. She watched him weigh the usefulness of her logic against his need to assert authority, and she watched the authority win, the way it always won with men like Breck. "You'll remove it from this village," he said. "Today, you'll take it back to the shrine and leave it there, and you will not interfere with whatever the goddess intends for it." No. The word landed in the yard like a stone dropped in a well. She heard one of Breck's men shift his weight. Breck himself went very still. "No?" he repeated very quietly. "It's an injured cub," Ellen said, and kept her voice level, because she had learned early that the most dangerous thing in an unequal argument was showing fear. "It's alive. It's eating. Whatever the curse is, it's not spreading. I've been handling it for 3 days, and I'm standing here having this conversation. I am not going to put it back in the rain to die, and I'm not going to pretend the humane thing to do is abandon it because it scares people. You are a wolfless omega," Breck said, each word deliberate and precise, with no rank, no standing, and no right to make decisions for this territory. "You are here because we allow you to be here. That can change." It was a real threat. She knew it was a real threat. The border territories were not kind to people with nowhere to go, and Breck's version of exile was not metaphorical. She had seen him send people out into the old forest before, into the territories where no pack claimed authority. And she knew what happened to people alone in the spaces between claims. She felt the fear of it move through her the way cold moves through cloth, slow and complete. But behind her, inside the shed, the cub made a small sound, and not a cry, not a bark, just a sound of presence, a sound that said, "I am here, and you are here, and I know the difference." "Give me a week," Ellen said. 1 week. "If I can't demonstrate that the danger isn't what we think it is, I'll do what you're asking." Breck looked at her for a long time. 3 days, he said, "and you keep it locked up. If anyone else in this village gets sick, I'm not waiting for the 3 days to be done." He left. His men left. The yard was quiet. Ellen went back inside and sat on the floor and let the cub climb into her lap, which it did with the total confidence of an animal that has decided where it belongs. And she sat there until the shaking in her hands stopped. 3 days, she said. We need to figure some things out in 3 days. The cub looked at her with its coin-gold eyes. She reached for her journal. Darrell sent the 4th search team on the 12th day. This one was different from the previous 3. The previous teams had been warriors, fast, capable, trained for pursuit and confrontation. This one he sent quietly, without formal announcement, without Corvin's involvement. 3 people. His best tracker, a woman named Sael, who had found things in the old forests that other trackers swore couldn't be found. His most trusted personal guard, a man named Torv, who had been with him since before the crown, and had the irreplaceable quality of telling him the truth, and his own sister's son, a young wolf named Pell, who had a sensitivity to magic that the court's official mages had tested and certified and then quietly never mentioned again because it made people uncomfortable. He sent them south. He sent them south because of something Pell had said on the 11th night, when the boy had fallen asleep over his dinner, and Darrell had been sitting at the table unable to eat, and the palace was quiet in the particular way. It got quiet when everyone was pretending things were normal. Pell had woken with a start, looked at Darrell with eyes that were still half in wherever he'd been, and said, "She's near the old forest. Near the shrine stones. I can feel her. It's like she's wrapped in something old." Then he'd come fully awake and said, "I'm sorry, I was dreaming," and looked embarrassed. Darrell had said nothing, but the next morning he had called Sael and Torv and Pell into a room with no one else in it and said, "South. The border territories. Start at the Scruggs boundary and work inward. Don't announce who you're looking for. Don't announce you're mine." "And if we find her?" Torv asked. "Come back to me. Don't engage with whoever has her until I'm there. And if she's—" Torv stopped. "Come back to me," Darrell said again. His voice was very quiet. "Whatever it is, come back to me." They left before dawn. What Darrell did not tell them, what he barely told himself, was that Pell's dream had matched something else. A report from a border intelligence contact that had come in on the 10th day, buried in a list of routine territorial updates that he had almost missed. A wolfless Omega in the Scruggs village had reportedly taken in a cursed wolf cub, bearing what witnesses were calling a silver mark. The contact had filed it as a local curiosity. 3 deaths associated with the cub, 1 reckless woman apparently immune to its effects. Silver mark. Darrell's daughter Julia carried a birthmark on her left shoulder, silver-white, branching, present from birth. The palace healer who had delivered her had said it was rare but not unheard of, a mark of the royal bloodline, occasionally appearing in children with strong magical inheritance. Darrell had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought about it constantly now. He did not tell Corvin about the southern lead. He told Corvin he was considering a diplomatic approach to the Silverclaw territory and required privacy to prepare his position. Corvin accepted this with the smooth professionalism that was his signature quality and withdrew to manage the search teams. Darrell had officially dispatched in 3 other directions. Then Darrell went to his daughter's room and sat in the chair beside her empty bed and talked to her the way he had talked to her every night of her life, telling her about the day, telling her what was happening, telling her the things a father tells a small girl who is listening, the things he never would have said to anyone else, the things that lived in the part of him the court never saw. "Someone is keeping you warm," he said, eventually, to the empty room and the last of the evening light. "I can feel it. Someone chose to stay when everyone else left. I don't know who she is yet, but when I find out, I'm going to—" He stopped. There was no word he knew that was large enough for what he was going to do. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I'm coming, Julia, whatever it takes. In Scruggs, 380 miles south, Ellen was sitting on the floor of her shed in the dark because the lamp oil had run out, and she hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. The cub was asleep in her lap. The mark pulsed softly in the darkness, silver and quiet, and by its light, Ellen was reading the last page of her mother's letter for the 100th time. The letter said, "Be kinder than the world deserves, and let nothing make you smaller than you are." She folded it carefully and put it back in the chest. Outside, for the first time since she'd brought the cub in, the rain had stopped. She didn't know why that felt significant. But it did. Breck's 3 days became 5 before he came back, and Ellen used every hour of them. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without drama, applying observation rather than assumption. She had no formal healer training. What she had was 3 years of sitting with animals that were dismissed as unsalvageable, and learning what their bodies told her when she listened carefully enough. The cub's body was telling her several things. First, whatever was wrong with it was not a conventional illness. There was no fever, no swelling, no sign of injury or infection. Its vitals were depressed but stable, breathing slower than normal for a puppet's age, heart rate low but consistent. It was thin. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond missing meals, but it was not dying from any physical cause she could identify. Second, the mark was not random. She had been watching it for days now, noting when it brightened and when it dimmed, correlating it with the cub's behavioral state. The mark was reactive. When the cub was calm, it was quiet. When the cub was stressed, it flared. It was not a disease. It was not a curse in the way curses were described in village stories. Something that spread, something that contaminated. It was something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. Third, and this was the thing she kept coming back to in the hours when the cub was asleep and the shed was quiet. The mark responded to her specifically. She had tested this carefully, bringing other things close: a cloth, a stick, the back of her hand versus her palm versus a fingertip, and watching the light. The light was quietest when she was touching the cub directly. The light was brighter, not in warning, but in something that looked almost like relief when she held it against her chest. That was not a curse. That was recognition. She wrote it all down. She made sketches of the mark's pattern, mapping the way it branched, noting the changes. She was not sure what she was building toward. But she had learned that when something didn't fit the story you'd been told, you didn't force it. You kept looking until the thing told you its own story. The cub, for its part, was beginning to unfold. By day 4 it was walking, still wobbly, still cautious, but walking, exploring the small perimeter of the shed with the concentrated interest of a creature cataloguing its territory. I was curious about her tools. It knocked her journal off the low shelf twice and seemed genuinely interested in the result. It was cautious with sound. Any loud noise outside made it freeze and press close to her, but it was growing less cautious with her. It had started anticipating her movements. When she reached for the water bowl, it moved out of her way before she asked. When she reached for it, it came. She had never had an animal do that before, not this fast. On day 4, late in the afternoon, a woman came to the shed, not a villager. She had heard the footsteps and registered them as unfamiliar. Wrong rhythm, wrong weight distribution, wrong boot sole. She had put herself between the cub and the door before the knock came. "Who is it?" "My name is Benita." The voice was older, measured, the kind of voice that had made many announcements and knew how to carry weight without raising volume. "I'm a traveling healer. I was told there was a situation here that might benefit from someone with my particular knowledge." "Who told you?" A pause. "Elder Marin wrote to me. We correspond. She thought I might be useful." Ellen opened the door a crack. The woman on the other side was perhaps 60, perhaps older. It was hard to tell with people who had spent their lives in motion, because the road did something to a face that made age difficult to calculate. Silver-grey hair in a braid down her back. Dark traveling clothes, heavy and practical. Eyes that were sharp in the specific way of someone who had spent decades looking at things other people found uncomfortable to look at. She looked at Ellen. She looked at the cub behind Ellen, who had come to stand at Ellen's heel with its coin-gold eyes level and its mark, pulsing that quiet silver. She went very still. Then she said quietly, to herself as much as to Ellen, "Oh, so it's real. What's real?" Ellen said. Benita looked at her. "May I come in?" Ellen opened the door the rest of the way. Benita came inside. She crouched. The fluid crouch of someone with no problem with their knees, which suggested she was either younger than she looked or had been disciplined about movement for decades. And looked at the cub at close range. The cub looked back without fear. "The mark," Benita said. "I've read about it. I didn't believe what I was reading, but I read it, and now I'm looking at it, and it matches the description exactly." "What description?" Benita sat on the floor, cross-legged, unself-conscious about it, in the way people are when they've stopped caring about dignity and started caring about being useful. She looked up at Ellen. "There is a bloodline," she said. "Very old, royal, going back before the current kingdoms. It was believed extinct, or rather, it was believed to have been driven extinct, which is different." She paused. "The bloodline manifests a mark at birth. The mark is not a curse. It was called a curse by enemies of the bloodline who wanted people to be afraid of it. The mark is a seal. It suppresses the bloodline's power until the bearer is ready." Ellen looked at the cub. "What bloodline?" she said. "The line of the first Moonshield wolves," Benita said. "Ancient protectors, the ones who could walk between curses the way you walk between raindrops. Not avoiding them, but not being touched by them. Their power was immunity, and something more. The ability to unmake magical constructs, old ones, the kind that have been building for centuries." The shed was very quiet. "This is a cub," Ellen said carefully. "Yes, a wolf cub from somewhere with a mark on its shoulder." "Yes. And you're telling me it's what exactly?" "Royal, ancient, magical?" Benita met her eyes. "I'm telling you that the mark responds to you, and that according to everything I've read, the only people the Moonshield mark responds to are those who carry the complementary bloodline, the bloodline that serves the shield." She paused. The line of the Moonshield wolves had protectors. People bonded to them across generations. People who were immune to the mark's effects, not because of magic, but because of what they were. She looked at Ellen for a long moment. "When did your wolf fail to emerge?" "Silence. 14, Ellen said. "And since then?" "Nothing. I'm wolfless." "Are you?" Benita said gently. "Or are you waiting?" Ellen had no answer to that. She sat with it, the way it landed, the way it opened something she had closed a long time ago. And she breathed, and she let herself not have an answer yet. The cub pushed its head under her hand. Sail found the trail on the 7th day. She came back to where Torv and Pell were making camp at the southern edge of the old forest, and said, "Wolf cub. Border village called Scruggs. There's a woman there who has it. The whole village is agitated about a curse." Torv looked at Pell. Pell was already nodding, eyes bright. "That's it," he said. "That's where I felt her." Torv sent the message north immediately, the way Darrell had told him to, and then they made camp and waited. Darrell arrived 36 hours later. He had ridden through the night, with 4 personal guards, moving faster than was dignified for a king, and not caring at all. He had told no one where he was going except Torv. He had told Corvin he was making a private inspection of the eastern training grounds. Corvin had smiled and said, "Of course." My king and Darrell had left before the smile was finished. He had not been to Scruggs in his life. He knew it the way a king knew border territories, as lines on a map, as names on reports, as numbers of contributing hunters and trade goods, and occasional disputes that required arbitration. He knew Breck by reputation, and by the quiet political friction the man generated The kind of low-grade resentment that never quite became a problem, but also never went away. He rode into the village at mid-morning and did not announce himself. He didn't have to. The presence of an alpha king has a quality that cannot be concealed, the way a source of heat cannot be concealed in a cold room. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The information moved through the village in seconds, the way information about danger always moves faster than information about anything else. Breck came out to meet him with 6 of his men, and the expression of a man who has been caught doing something. He isn't sure he needs to be ashamed. Of my king, he said. This is unexpected. I'm looking for someone, Darrell said. He had dismounted. He stood in the village square, and his voice was not raised, but it carried the way voices do when the person speaking them has learned not to waste. Volume. A woman, wolfless. I'm told she has a wolf cub in her care. He watched something move through Breck's face, calculation, and beneath it, the beginning of understanding. Ellen, Breck said. Take me to her. He found her in the shed. She was sitting on the floor, which somehow struck him more than anything else. The fact that she was sitting on the floor of a small shed with animal medicine tools spread around her, and a journal open in her lap, and the cub was asleep against her thigh. When the door opened, she was already on her feet, positioning herself between the door and the cub before she'd fully registered who was there. He stopped. He looked at the cub. The mark. Silver, branching, pulsing slowly in the rhythm he had watched at his daughter's bedside for the first year of her life, the rhythm he had memorized without knowing he was memorizing it, the rhythm that was as familiar to him as breathing. Julia. The word came out of him without permission, not loud, barely sound at all. The cub's golden eyes opened. It looked at him, and it made a sound, not the cry he hadn't heard in 12 days, but the sound a child makes when someone familiar comes into a dark room. A sound of recognition. Darrell went to his knees, not deliberately, not with ceremony. His legs simply stopped holding him up because the 12 days of no sleep and no food and no answer had been building toward this moment. And now that the moment was here, his body decided that upright was not an option. He was on his knees on the floor of a shed in a border village, and he reached for the cub, and the cub came to him. Unsteadily, slowly, still weak from whatever it had been through, and pressed against his chest. He said her name against her fur. He said it several more times. He held her and breathed. Ellen stood 2 feet away and did not move. She watched a man. A king, she registered distantly, because the chain was obvious and the bearing was obvious, and the guards outside the door were obvious. Hold a wolf cub the way you hold the only thing that matters, and let it matter, completely, without the dignity of pretending it didn't. After a long time, he looked up at her. His eyes were amber, the way Pell had described them, and wet in the way eyes get when there is nowhere left for grief to go except out. He looked at her, the wolfless woman in the torn shawl, in the shed that smelled of animal medicine and lamp oil, with her journal still open on the floor, and her hands at her sides, and her expression that was careful and watchful and not quite steady. He rose. Not all the way to standing. He rose until he was 1 knee up, 1 knee down, which, in the language of wolf hierarchy, meant something. So specific that the men outside the door would be talking about it for the rest of their lives. You kept her alive, he said. Ellen blinked. I didn't know who she was. I know. I heard her crying, and I couldn't. She stopped. Something was happening to her voice that she didn't have the resources to manage right now, and she pressed her hand to her sternum for a moment and breathed. I couldn't leave. I know, he said again, and then, because there was no sufficient language for this, he said simply, Thank you. The cub, Julia, turned in his arms to look at Ellen. She looked at her father. She looked back at Ellen. Then she extended 1 small paw, the way pups reach when they want something, and pressed it against Darrell's arm in the direction of Ellen. It was the clearest thing she had done in 12 days. Darrell looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the woman standing in the shed. "What is your name?" he said. "Ellen," she said. "Ellen." He said it like he was filing it somewhere important. "My name is Darrell, and whatever you need from this point forward, you have it." Ryan heard about it on the 14th day. He heard about it the way he always heard about things. Sideways, through 3 intermediaries, wrapped in enough distance that nothing could be traced back to him. His contact in Scruggs was a minor position, a man who recorded trade flow and reported anomalies, not the kind of person anyone would think to look for. The contact reported the Alpha King's arrival, his time in the village, and his departure with the wolf cub, along with the Wolfless Omega, who had apparently been invited, not commanded, invited, to come with them. Ryan sat with that information for a long time. He was a patient man. This was his most essential quality, the patience to let situations develop, to not flinch when plans shifted, to find the thread in a new weave and pull it. He had been planning the current situation for 3 years, and he was very good at not letting his face reflect what his mind was doing. He was seated at his desk in the east wing of the Blackmire Palace when the contact's report reached him, and he read it twice and then burned it the way he burned all written communications, and then he sat for a moment and thought. The girl was alive. That was a problem, but a manageable one. The plan had never required her death, only her absence, and her absence had served its purpose for the past 12 days. The kingdom had been destabilized in useful ways. Darrell had been distracted in useful ways. Certain political arrangements that required the king's inattention had been advanced in useful ways. But now the girl was found, and she was coming back, and she was coming back in the company of a Wolfless Omega from Scruggs who had, apparently, impossibly, managed to keep her alive through contact with the Moonshield mark. Ryan's fingers were very still on the desk. He had known about the Moonshield bloodline. He had known Julia carried it. The reason he had chosen the method he'd chosen, the ancient binding magic, the curse seal he'd hired a practitioner of the old arts to activate, was precisely because it would make the child untouchable, beyond retrieval, protected by fear from anyone who might try to help her. The seal was supposed to guarantee that anyone who tried to intervene would die. The deaths of the 3 Scruggs villagers had confirmed it was working. And then a Wolfless Omega had picked up the cub and not died. He thought about the implications of that for a very long time. Then he reached for paper and began to write. He needed to know who Ellen was. He needed to know her history, her bloodline, what she was. Because the only way the Moonshield mark dimmed for someone who wasn't royal was if that person carried something the mark recognized. Something old. Something the histories recorded, and Ryan had studied in those long, patient years of planning. The shield-bearer bloodline. The companion line. The people the Moonshield wolves had bonded with across generations. He had believed it extinct. Apparently, he had believed wrong. He sealed the letter with a plain wax closure and sent it to 3 different contacts, in Scruggs, in the Eastern Archives, and in the old records office of a territory that had once been allied with the Moonshield line. And then he went to dinner and sat 3 seats from the king and said the right things and made the right expressions and refilled his water glass and smiled. At the Scruggs territory border, a small traveling party was making its way north. Darrell rode at the front. Julia traveled in a carrier specifically adapted for small wolf cubs, warm and covered, pressed against Darrell's chest where she could hear his heartbeat. She had not shifted back to human form yet. Whatever the binding had done to her was not resolved by reunion, though she was clearly stronger for it. Eating and drinking and responding with more energy than Ellen had seen from her in a week. Ellen rode behind Darrell on a horse that belonged to one of the guards, borrowed without ceremony. She was not a practiced rider. She was managing. She was also managing the fact that she had left everything she owned in the shed. Her journal, her mother's chest, her medicinal herbs, and Darrell had sent Torv back for it before she finished mentioning it, which meant she was carrying approximately nothing except the things in her pockets, and the information in her head, and the strange floating feeling of a life that had shifted so suddenly that the ground beneath her was still arriving. Benita had agreed to come as far as the next major settlement. She had her own travel schedule, she said, her own places to be, but she had pressed Ellen's hands between her own before they'd parted and said, low enough that only Ellen could hear, "What's happening to you has been a long time coming. Don't be afraid of what you find." Ellen had thought about that for 2 hours of riding. Torv pulled even with her toward evening. He was a broad, quiet man, older than the guards, with a way of moving that suggested he had stopped needing to prove things about himself some years back. He rode without conversation for a while, which Ellen found she appreciated. Then he said, "He hasn't slept in 12 days. I noticed," Ellen said. "He won't tell you that. I know. He's not." Torv paused, choosing words the way someone picks footing on uncertain ground. "He's not the easiest person, right now especially. He's carrying a lot, and he's not good at putting it down." Ellen looked at the back of Darrell's shoulders, rigid, controlled, holding everything in the specific way of someone who has decided that control is the only viable strategy. She looked at Julia, curled against him. She looked at the way his left hand, the one that wasn't holding the reins, rested lightly on the carrier. "He doesn't have to be easy," she said. "He just has to be honest." Torv looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of respect, filed away for later. "Fair enough," he said. They rode on. Behind them, 300 miles back and moving carefully through the dark, a man named Ryan's letters were already on their way. The palace of Blackmire was nothing like anything Ellen had ever seen. She had seen the village elders' hall, which was the largest building in Scruggs, and was roughly the size of Blackmire's entrance hall. She had seen the trading post in the next settlement, which was 3 stories and had always seemed excessive. She had never been to a city. She had certainly never been to a palace. She walked through the gates and looked up at the walls and thought, "This is too large." Something in her insisted that buildings shouldn't be this large, that they exceeded some natural threshold of rightness. Then she looked at Julia, who had shifted back to her human form, somewhere around the northern tree line. A small girl with black hair and gold eyes, and a deliberate expression that suggested she found the world interesting and was not going to be bothered by anything in it. And who was currently walking beside her, holding her hand with the casual authority of a child who has decided something and is not going to revisit it. She thought about that building being this large because it contained everything a kingdom ran on, and it felt slightly less wrong. The court was a different matter. Courts, Ellen found, were not so different from villages. They just had more resources for performing hierarchy, the same watching, the same calculation, the same rapid assessment of where a new person fits in the existing structure. In Scruggs, being wolfless had put her at the bottom of that structure so automatically and so long ago that she had stopped noticing the assessment. Here, the assessment landed differently. She wasn't wolfless in the way they understood it. She was an unknown quantity, which in some ways was more unsettling to people than a known deficiency. The healer Marin met her on the second day. He was the chief healer of Blackmire, precise, bearded, the kind of man who had been right about things for long enough that he had lost the habit of entertaining the possibility that he might sometimes be wrong. He looked at Ellen's notes, the journal she had kept on Julia, the observations about the mark, the correlation data, and he was quiet for a while. "This is thorough," he said, in the specific tone of someone who means to say, "This is impressive," but has not yet decided if it requires them to adjust their self-image. "I had time," Ellen said. The correlation between mark intensity and the subject's emotional state You mapped this over 7 days? 6.5. The first half day I was focused on keeping her alive. Marin looked at her over the journal. Then he looked at it again. Then he put it down on his desk and leaned back. I've been the chief healer here for 19 years, he said. In 19 years, no one in this palace, no one with training, with access, with resources, identified the mark as a reactive seal rather than a contagion. You identified it in 6 days, in a shed, with animal medicine tools. I didn't have assumptions to work around, Ellen said. I didn't know what it was supposed to be, so I just watched what it was. Marin was quiet for a moment. The girl needs the seal broken, he said. Whatever binding was placed on her, it suppressed her shift, as well as the mark. She's holding together now because she's back with the king, and she's strong, but the binding is still active. It's going to cause problems. I know, Ellen said. I've been reading about it. She had found Benita's books in her bag, 3 slim volumes that she had not put there herself, but which had been folded into her mother's chest, among her things when Torv retrieved them, which either meant Benita had included them deliberately, or meant something else that Ellen was not ready to think about yet. She had been reading for 2 days without stopping much. The binding was created to suppress a specific magical signature, which means it was created by someone who knew what that signature was. Which means someone with access to the old texts, Marin said. Someone in the palace, Ellen said. They looked at each other. You understand, he said carefully, that I am going to need you to be very certain before you say that to anyone else. I'm not saying it to anyone else yet, Ellen said. I'm saying it to you. Because I think you need to know, and because I think you're someone who does something with information rather than sitting on it. Marin looked at her again. Then he stood and held out his hand. I would like to work with you on this, he said. If that's agreeable. She shook his hand. Meanwhile, Darrell was managing a political situation that had been deteriorating for 12 days and had not improved now that he was back. The Silverclaw Alpha, a man named Greth, massive and weathered, and carrying 2 generations' worth of border disputes like armor, had sent a delegation while Darrell was absent. The delegation had been met by Corvin, which was proper procedure, and the meeting had apparently gone fine, which was what Corvin reported. But something about the way Corvin reported it, too smooth, too complete, too neatly resolved, made Darrell read the transcripts himself. The transcripts were fine. They matched Corvin's summary precisely. That was the problem. Corvin's summaries were always fine. They always matched. There was never a discrepancy, never a gap, never the kind of minor friction between summary and record. That was the natural result of real conversations, being recorded by real humans with limited recall. In 19 months of being Darrell's chief advisor, Corvin had not once produced a summary that required even minor correction. That was not how humans worked. Darrell put the transcripts away and said nothing. But he was thinking. Linda came to his study that evening. She was the palace's senior war advisor, a silver-blonde woman whose precision and capability Darrell had relied on for years, and who had made no secret of the fact that she considered herself a viable candidate for a political alliance with the crown, which was the careful way everyone in court referred to the fact that she thought she should be queen. She had never been rude about it, which was one of the things Darrell appreciated about her. She had ambitions, and she pursued them cleanly, without the kind of covert maneuvering that he had learned to spot and despise. The wolfless woman from the border, she said, without preamble. When the door was closed, she sat. She was one of the only people in the palace who sat without being offered a seat, which was a small dominance signal, and she knew it and didn't care. She's been in Marin's archives for 2 days. Yes, she's not formally trained, no. She identified a connection between the mark and the binding in less than a week, which Marin and his entire staff missed, for 12 days. Yes. Linda paused. What is she? I don't know yet, Daryl said. I'm finding out. You should find out faster, Linda said. Because if there's someone in this court who put that binding on Julia, they're going to find out about the Scruggs woman before you've had time to build defenses. Daryl looked at her. What do you know? Nothing specific, she said. But I've been watching Corvin. He's been doing a lot of quiet correspondence. More than his role requires. Daryl said nothing. I'm not asking you to act on that yet, she said. I'm asking you to watch. I'm watching, he said. She left. He went back to the transcripts. He read them until the words stopped making sense, and then he went to Julia's room, where she was asleep in her human form for the first time. In 12 days, one fist curled under her cheek, the mark on her shoulder quiet and silver in the dark. He sat beside her bed and watched her breathe. He thought about the woman in the shed who had watched her breathe the same way, alone for 6 days, with no reason to stay, except that she couldn't bring herself to leave. He thought that was a kind of power he didn't have a word for yet. Ryan moved on the 22nd day. He had his answer by then. 3 different sources had confirmed it, the Eastern Archives and the Scruggs contact, and a third source he kept for situations requiring certainty. And the answer was what he had suspected. Ellen was a shield-bearer. The bloodline had not been extinct. It had been dormant, hidden in wolfless individuals who showed no obvious sign of their heritage, passing generation to generation in families that didn't know what they were. The problem was not that she existed. The problem was that she was in the palace, working with Marin, with access to the archives, and she had started asking questions that were getting close to the one question he needed her not to ask. He needed to move the situation. His plan was not complicated. It didn't need to be. He had access to the palace schedule, to the security rotations, to the architectural layouts of the building. He had people in positions, not many, but enough, who were loyal to the future he was building rather than the present he was navigating. He needed Julia out of the palace again, and he needed it to happen in a way that would be read as an outside attack. The Silverclaw Alpha was a convenient villain, already primed with existing border tensions, and Ryan had been carefully fertilizing those tensions for months. He set it for the following night. He did not account for Pell. Pell had been restless since they'd returned to the palace. Restless in the specific way he got when his sensitivity was picking something up that his conscious mind hadn't processed yet. He had told Torv about it on the 18th day. He had told Daryl on the 20th. Daryl had increased the guard rotations without explanation, and told Pell to sleep near Julia's room. On the night Ryan moved, Pell was awake. He felt it before the first of Ryan's people reached the corridor. A shift in the palace's background hum, a change in the magical atmosphere that he couldn't describe in any terms except wrong. He was on his feet and at Julia's door before he understood why. What happened next was fast and loud and brutal in the specific way that close quarters situations always were, which was nothing like how they sounded in stories. No time, no beauty, just the immediate urgent geometry of bodies and doors. And the small girl who needed to not be where they were trying to put her. Pell got Julia out through the window. He got her to the east courtyard, which was where Ellen found them, because Ellen had also been awake. She had been in Marin's workroom 3 floors down, reading, and she had heard the sound and been moving before she knew what she was moving toward. She found them in the courtyard in the dark, Pell bleeding from a cut above his eye, Julia in her wolf form again, the mark flaring bright, the binding responding to threat by activating, trembling against the boy's leg. Ellen went to her knees immediately. She put her hands on the cub, and the mark began to dim. "Go," she told Pell. "Get Torv, get the king, go now." He went. She stayed. She sat in the courtyard in the dark with a mark that was currently the brightest light in the east wing, making her and Julia into a beacon for anyone looking, and she thought, "This is either very brave or very stupid, and probably both, and that is apparently who I am." She heard footsteps behind her. They were the wrong footsteps. Not Pell coming back, not Torv, not Darrell. She turned. Ryan stood at the courtyard entrance. He looked different than he did at official functions. The composure was still there. The manufactured stillness that had passed for calm for years. But underneath it, something else had surfaced. Something that was neither patience nor stillness, but simply calculation made visible. Now that visibility no longer mattered. "Step away from the child," he said. "No," Ellen said. He looked at her. She had the sense of being weighed in a way that was completely different from the way the court had been weighing her. This was not the assessment of social threat, but the assessment of physical obstacles. She was a wolfless Omega. She had no wolf. She was sitting on a courtyard floor. "You understand," he said, almost conversationally, "that none of the things you think you are actually what you are. Wolfless, harmless, ignorable. That's what they told you. That's what you believed. But you've been walking around this palace for 3 weeks, carrying something that can unmake everything I've built, and you haven't even." He stopped. "Then, move away from her. This is the last time I'm going to ask." "I know who you are," Ellen said. "I know what you did. I know the binding came from inside this palace, and I know about the Silverclaw correspondence, and I know about the Eastern Archives access." His expression didn't change. "None of that helps you right now." "No," she agreed, "but he knows it." Ryan turned. Darrell was standing at the other end of the courtyard. He had not come from the direction Ryan had come. He had come from the inner passage, the one that connected the east courtyard to the king's own corridor, the one that only Torv and Darrell used. He stood in the entrance with 6 guards behind him, and the specific stillness of someone who has been angry for a very long time and has just found somewhere to put it. "Corvin," he said. Not loud, the name landed like a stone. Ryan's composure held for 3 more seconds, then it left him. What happened after that took most of the night and involved lawyers and guards, and the kind of formal procedure that kingdoms required when they had to process betrayal at the highest level. It was exhausting and ugly and necessary. Ellen sat through most of it in a chair outside the king's chamber, with Julia asleep in her lap, and Torv standing nearby and the mark pulsing its slow, quiet rhythm against her hand. Marin came and assessed them both. He cleaned the cut on Pell's face and declared Ellen physically unharmed, and said that Julia's mark was calmer than it had been since she'd arrived, and that he considered this significant. Linda came and stood in the corridor for a moment, looked at Ellen, looked at Julia, and said nothing. But the look said something. The kind of recalculation that happened when someone decided their assessment of a situation had been wrong and were adjusting. It was almost dawn when Darrell came out. He looked like the 12 days of no sleep had resumed without interruption, except now they had been joined by additional weight that hadn't been there before. The specific weight of discovering that the threat had been 3 feet to his left for months, invisible because he'd been looking in the right places for the wrong thing. He sat in the chair next to Ellen. He looked at Julia. "She's sleeping," Ellen said. "Good." "Silence. You knew," he said, "before tonight. You knew it was someone inside. I suspected. I told Marin. We were building toward proof before we moved. You should have told me." "You were managing 12 things," she said. "I was managing one, I thought." She paused. "I thought I had more time." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to apologize for that." "I wasn't apologizing. I was explaining." Something moved in his expression. He looked at her in the specific way he had looked at her in the shed. Direct, without the management layer that he put between himself and most things. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No one ever expects wolfless," she said. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. He looked at her. Julia breathed between them. "Get some sleep," Ellen said eventually. "Both of you need to be alive tomorrow for whatever comes next." He almost smiled. She saw it happen and stop. "Yes," he said, and he reached for Julia, and Julia settled against him without waking. and he sat there for a while longer in the chair next to Ellen's, and the palace was quiet around them, in the specific quiet of something very bad being over. The moonfire ceremony was scheduled for the full moon, which was 8 days away. Marin had decided it was the right time. The alignment of the moon's power with the old magic would create conditions that made breaking the binding more possible. He had spent 2 weeks studying the seal with Ellen, and what they had found was this. The binding was a constructed curse, layered on top of Julia's natural mark. The moon shield seal was the foundation. Ryan's corruption was the overlay. To remove the corruption without disrupting the natural seal required something the texts called a resonant, unmaking, a dissolution performed by someone whose bloodline was tuned to the moon shield frequency, the shield bearer. Marin had explained this to Darryl, with the particular carefulness of someone delivering news that cannot be undone by the listener's reaction to it. Darryl had listened. He had been very still. Then he said, "Ellen, yes," Marin said, "but her wolf hasn't emerged." "The resonant unmaking doesn't require a shifted form," Marin said. "It requires bloodline, and her bloodline is present. We've confirmed it through 3 independent tests. The mark responds to her. The response is consistent and measurable. She is what the old texts describe as a latent shield bearer." He paused. "But there is a secondary consideration." Darryl waited. "The unmaking will trigger her wolf," Marin said. "The dormant bloodline, once activated in the way the unmaking requires, will awaken completely. Her wolf will emerge. It will be..." He paused again. "The texts suggest it will not be a conventional wolf form. What does that mean?" "It means," Marin said carefully, "that we don't know exactly what will happen. We know it will resolve the binding. We know it will restore Julia to full health. We know it will be visible to everyone present." He looked at Darryl. "I think you need to consider whether a public ceremony is the right venue." Darryl had thought about it. He had thought about it for 2 days. Then he talked to Ellen. He had found her in the archive, which was where she always was now when she wasn't with Julia, surrounded by books and her own notes, and the occasional bewildered palace scholar who had come in for their own research, and found that the unfamiliar young woman in the corner had usually already read the relevant section. He had sat across the table from her and told her what Marin had said. She had been quiet through all of it. "So," she said, when he was done, "the ceremony breaks the binding on Julia. Yes. And in the process, whatever I am, wakes up. That's what the texts suggest." She looked at her hands. They were ordinary hands, a little rough from years of work, the nails cut short for practicality. She had spent 17 years believing that those ordinary hands were all there was. "I'm not afraid of that part," she said slowly. "I'm afraid of what happens if it doesn't work. If I'm standing in front of the whole court, and I try and do nothing." She stopped. "Marin is certain," Darryl said. "Marin is very intelligent and also has been wrong about the mark for his entire professional career," she said, not unkindly. "Certainty is easier when it's theory." He was quiet. "But Julia needs the binding broken," she said. "And if this is how it happens, then this is how it happens." She looked up. "I'm not someone who looks away," he held her gaze. "No," he said, "you're not." There was a moment. It was not a courtly moment. It was not managed or calculated or appropriate to the setting. It was simply 2 people in a room full of old books, in the pause between one version of things and the next, looking at each other without the protection of role or distance. "I'll be there," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." The moonfire ceremony was held in the main courtyard of Blackmoor Palace on the night of the full moon. The court attended. The senior pack members attended. The representatives of allied territories attended. Linda was there in her formal attire, silver blonde and precise, standing near the front. Marin was there at the ceremony's edge with everything he'd need if something went wrong. Torv was there, and Pell, and the household wolves who had been with Darryl since before the crown. The Scruggs delegation was there too. Elder Marin had come, because when Darrell sent an invitation to Scruggs, she had apparently decided that 81 years old was not too old to travel, and she had arrived with 3 of the village's senior pack members. And the expression of a woman who had suspected something like this was coming. Julia stood in the center of the courtyard in her human form. She was in white, a small child in white, very serious, with her father's hand in hers, and her gold eyes level and unafraid. The mark on her shoulder pulsed its silver light, brighter here than Ellen had ever seen it, responding to the moon and the ceremony and the concentration of old energy in space. Ellen stood across from her. She had been given formal clothes, a deep green, that Darrell had apparently chosen himself, which she had been told by Torv, with such careful casualness, that it was obviously meant to be significant, and which she had filed away to think about later. Her chestnut hair was loose. She stood in the center of the courtyard under the full moon, and looked at Julia and breathed. She had been practicing, not the ceremony itself. There was nothing to practice. The texts were clear that it was not a ritual with steps, but a release, a permission given rather than a thing performed. What she had been practicing was herself. The part of herself she had been keeping behind the door she'd closed at 14. The part that had been quiet for 3 years, waiting. Marin began the formal recitation. The acknowledgement of the moon, the invocation of the old bloodlines, the naming of what was present. His voice was steady and precise, the voice of a man who respected the gravity of things and did not waste it. Julia looked at Ellen across the courtyard. She looked at her the way she had looked at her in the shed, with that specific certainty that children have when they have decided something completely and without reservation. That look that said, "You," Ellen thought. "I will not leave you," she reached, not with her hands. With whatever it was she'd been carrying for 17 years, the thing that had no name until now. The thing that had sat with dying animals and helped them hold on and changed the temperature of a room by walking into it and dimmed a curse mark just by touching it. The thing that was not wolfless. The thing that had been waiting. The response was immediate and total, and nothing like anything she had prepared for. It was not painful. It was the opposite of pain. It was the specific relief of something that has been held too tightly for too long, finally being allowed to expand. She felt it move through her from the center outward, silver white and warm, the same color as Julia's mark, but brighter, filling her from the inside out like water, filling a vessel that had always been the right shape for it. The courtyard went very bright. The wolf came. Not the way the village children's wolves had come on the shifting grounds. Not the dramatic physical change she had watched from a distance at 14. This was something else. Something that arrived alongside her rather than replacing her. Something that was continuous with what she'd always been rather than separate from it. She felt it settle. Immense and quiet and silver white. The same color as the light, as old as the text said, and completely, entirely hers. The corruption on Julia's mark, Ryan's binding, the constructed curse, the overlay of old stolen magic, came apart. She felt it dissolve. She felt the moment it released, like a knot untying that had been pulled tight so long the rope had forgotten its own shape. Julia made a sound, a small single sound, like a window opening. Then the silver light dimmed. The courtyard was quiet. Ellen was standing. She was still herself. She was entirely herself, more herself than she had been at any point in her memory. And the wolf was present, recognizable to every wolf in the courtyard in the way that presences like that are always recognizable, ancient and specific and real. Julia was standing in the center of the courtyard. The mark on her shoulder was still there, the moonshield seal, the natural one, glowing softly, no longer suppressed, no longer distorted. Julia was looking at her hands. She turned them over with the focused interest of a child discovering something. Then she looked up at Ellen with those gold eyes and said, clearly and firmly, in the voice of a very small girl who has been quiet for too long. "You came." "I came," Ellen said. The moon above the courtyard was the brightest thing in the sky. Darrell walked from the edge of the courtyard to the center. He walked past the court representatives, and the senior pack, and the senior advisors, and Linda, and Marin, and Torv, and all of the watching, waiting people. He walked to where Ellen was standing. He went to one knee. Not the partial kneel he had given her in the shed, one knee up, one knee down. This was both knees. Both knees on the stones of his own courtyard, in front of his entire court, in the full light of the moonfire ceremony's aftermath. The silence was complete. "You protected my daughter," he said, "when no one would. You stayed when there was no reason to stay. You kept her alive when the thing keeping her was supposed to kill anyone who touched it. You identified the threat when everyone who was supposed to be looking missed it. And then you stood in the center of my courtyard and gave her back to herself." He looked up at her. His amber eyes were very clear. "I do not have language for what I owe you, but I want to begin by asking." He paused, and in the pause, something personal replaced the formal language. Something that had been building since a shed in Scruggs, and had nowhere left to go except forward. "Will you let me?" Ellen looked at him. She looked at Julia, who was standing at his shoulder with her arms folded and her gold eyes serious in the plew, way of someone who has already decided this is right and is waiting for the adults to catch up. She thought about the girl who had stood on the shifting grounds at 14 and felt nothing shift. She thought about the shed and the rain and the 4 words and the long road north. She thought about her mother's letter, "Be kinder than the world deserves, and let nothing make you smaller than you are." She reached down and put her hand in his. "Get up," she said. "We have work to do." He rose. Julia took Ellen's other hand. They stood in the center of the courtyard, under the full moon. The king, the child, and the woman everyone had overlooked. And the court of Blackmire was very still and very quiet around them, which was the appropriate response to witnessing something that would be told in stories for a long time. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing real is simple. Ryan was tried under Blackmore law with Corvin's testimony, which he gave cleanly and completely, because it turned out that Ryan's patience had extended only as far as his plan's success, and now that his plan had failed, he was a man who had spent 3 years building something and had nothing left to protect. He named every contact, every correspondence, every piece of the apparatus he'd constructed. He did it with the exhausted precision of someone who has stopped pretending. The Silverclaw Alpha, Greth, received the evidence of Ryan's manipulation of their board attentions and was furious in the specific way of a man who had believed himself to be making his own choices, and now had to confront the fact that he had been played. He came to Blackmire not to make war, but to make a reckoning. And the reckoning resulted in a treaty that was more substantial than anything 3 years of conventional diplomacy had managed, because Greth was the kind of man who respected being shown the truth of a thing, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Linda had a long conversation with Darrell, in which several things were said plainly that had been communicated obliquely for years. She remained the senior war advisor. She was very good at it. The other thing she'd been, the viable candidate, she put down without being asked, because as she had watched Ellen stand in the courtyard and done her own reckoning. Marin spent 6 weeks writing a paper on the Moonshield bloodline and its clinical manifestations. He sent it to every healer academy in the territories. He cited Ellen's 6-day field observation in the abstract as the foundational research on reactive seal identification. He mentioned this to Ellen and she said, "I was just watching carefully," and he said, "Yes, that's the entire point." And then he made her the palace's research healer, which was a position he invented for the occasion, because no existing position covered what she was. Julia recovered fully. The binding dissolved completely in the weeks after the ceremony, and her natural seal settled back to its quiet baseline, and she shifted into her human form more reliably than before. And she was healthy and loud and opinionated in the specific way of a 4-year-old who has decided the world owes as her engagement. She called Ellen by a name that was not Ellen, a name she invented herself, and refused to abandon, regardless of what anyone said, which was her right as the person in question. Ellen let her. Her wolf settled around her like something that had always been present and was now no longer hiding. It was not like the wolves of the village. It was quieter and heavier and old in a way that didn't announce itself. When she walked through the palace, the animals went still. When she entered a room where someone was sick, the sick person breathed easier. She was not a healer in the official sense. She had no formal training, no degrees, no certification. And she was the most effective healer the palace had ever housed, which Marin said with the specific satisfaction of a man who has made peace with a paradox. She wrote to Elder Marin in Scruggs. She wrote regularly, and Marin wrote back with the brevity of someone who had opinions and the economy of words to match, and across those letters something like forgiveness was built. Not for the village's treatment of her, which Marin did not excuse, and Ellen did not forget, but for the fact that people afraid of things they don't understand do what people afraid of things have always done, and that understanding that was not the same as pardoning it, but was the first step towards something better. She wrote to Benita, too. Benita's letters came from different places each time, because Benita was always somewhere else, and they were warm and specific, and often contained additional books. The palace was large, and she was still learning its geometry. She got lost occasionally in corridors she hadn't mapped yet, and found her way back by the specific method of paying attention to where she was, rather than where she expected to be, which was the same method she'd used for everything else. Darryl found her in the archive one evening, with Julia asleep at her feet under the table, and 3 books open, and her journal half filled, and the look on her face that meant she had found something interesting, and was not going to stop until she'd followed it all the way to its end. He sat across from her. He had learned that she worked better if he didn't interrupt it, so he sat and read his own papers, and they were quiet together in the way that takes time to build. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of things to say, but the presence of enough ease to not need to say them. After a while, she looked up. "I found something," she said. "You always find something. This is different." She turned the book toward him. The Moonshield bloodline. The texts say the seal never activates in the same person twice, but they also say, she pointed, the power can be passed, trained into the next generation. If we document the activation, if we understand the mechanism. She stopped. There might be other latent bearers, people who grew up wolfless because their bloodline was waiting for the right. She paused. What I went through doesn't have to be what they go through. If someone had known, if someone had just known to look differently. He was reading where she pointed. His expression shifted. That particular shift she'd learned to recognize, where the king and the man collapsed into the same person, and the same person was paying complete attention. "How many?" he said. "Potentially." She sat back. "In the territories? Dozens, maybe more. People living wolfless who aren't wolfless. People being told they're less than they are because no one knows the right questions to ask." He looked at her across the table. Julia turned in her sleep, one fist uncurling, and the mark on her shoulder pulsed once, quiet and silver like a heartbeat, like a lamp kept burning in a window for someone the darkness hasn't stopped. "Then we learn the questions," he said. "Yes," Ellen said. "We do." She reached for her journal. He reached for his pen. Julia slept at their feet in the library of a palace that had been too large when she arrived, and was now, slowly and without announcement, becoming something she recognized. Something that felt, in the careful and unfinished way of real things, like home. Subscribe to see how this unfolds. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.